Brigitte, tell me about your family and what it was like to be raised as a young child in Lebanon.
I was born and raised in South Lebanon, in a little town called Marjayoun, on the border with Israel. My parents were married for 22 years. They were not able to have any children, and my mother was 55 years old, and my father was 60 when I was born. I was fortunate to live with two parents that loved me and dedicated their life to me. They were retired by that time because they had me in later years. My father was running a restaurant. He owned a restaurant and a lot of real estate. So I was raised in a place where I got to meet a lot of members in the community who came there to eat or to visit with my parents and have a cup of coffee. And I was able to hear adult conversation, talking about politics, talking about religion, talking about the situation in the Middle East. And as usual, we always had a war going on or a conflict going on. Even though I was raised in a Christian country, we were very much still influenced by Arabic opinion. We were very much influenced by the Arabic countries surrounding us. And we spoke Arabic, we practiced the Arabic culture. So we thought like the Arabs thought. We thought Israel was bad. I was taught growing up as a child that Israel, Azrael, Israel is Satan. The Jews are demons. They are barbaric. They are the source of the problems in the Middle East. And the only time we will have peace in the Middle East is when we kill all the Jews and drive them into the sea. That's what I heard on television. That's what I heard on the radio. That's what I saw people talk about when they would come to my father's restaurant and they would be sitting around the tables talking. That was the opinion of the Lebanese people at the time. We listened to the media that was governed by our government, so we only heard what our government wanted us to hear. As usual in the Middle East, it's always a one-sided story. You never hear the other side because all the media and all the Arabic countries are manipulated by the government. I went to a Christian private school, and even in my private school, in my Bible class, we never studied the Old Testament. Our Bibles did not include the Old Testament because the Old Testament was considered the enemy's book. It was the Torah, and the Bible had nothing to do with it.
Tell me a little bit about the population of Lebanon. Who's who and who was what back then?
When we got our independence from France in the 1940s, the majority of the population in Lebanon were Christians. The Muslims were the minority. As the years passed by, that population shifted because we do not have as many children as the Muslims do. The Christians got married to one spouse until death do us part. We have maybe 3, 4 children, while the Muslims are allowed to marry up to 4 wives at a time according to their religion. So they would marry multiple wives and they would have a lot of children. The most famous Muslim in the world today is Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is 1 out of 53 children. He himself has 27 children. Between father and son, they have produced 80 children. How many Christian families do you know that have 80 children? It's just impossible. We don't do that. And that's what shifted the population in Lebanon. The Muslims multiplied at a much faster pace than we did. And after 20, 30 years of that, they became the majority, we became the minority. Even though we held the positions of professionals, we were more educated simply because we did not have as many children. So we were able to send our kids to college. Education was very, very important to us. The Muslims, on the other hand, simply by the sheer fact as having many children, they were not able to educate their children as much as we were able to educate ours. And it was just a completely different culture within a culture. It was a very different 2 segments of society.
What was another factor that affected the balance between the Christians and the Muslims in Lebanon?
Another factor that affected the balance was the influx of the Palestinians out of Jordan and into Lebanon in 1970. Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians tried to throw King Hussein out of power. Yasser Arafat wanted to create a base in which to fight Israel. When he failed to do that in Jordan, and King Hussein kicked them out into Lebanon, we took them in. We already had Palestinian refugee camps set up. So the majority of the Palestinians that came from Jordan into Lebanon were Muslims. We already had a problem in the balance already in Lebanon between the Christians and the Muslims, but with the influx of the Palestinians into Lebanon, them being Muslims, it aggravated the problem. And Yasser Arafat tried to do in Lebanon exactly what he tried to do in Jordan, create another base in which to fight Israel. And he succeeded. And in order to do that, he had to control the population. So he put his head together with the Muslims in Lebanon, and together they declared jihad on the Christians, and that's how the civil war started.
Well, when did things take a turn for the worse for you and your family?
Things started changing for us, as far as I remember, around 1974. Every year we used to go spend the holidays in Beirut with the rest of my family because it was only my mom and my dad lived in Marjayoun. And we stopped going. And I would ask my father, how come we're not spending Christmas in Beirut with the rest of the family? And he would give me some lame excuse like, well, we decided to stay home this Christmas. And I could not understand as a child. Later, I found out that the reason why we were staying home is because the Muslims and the Palestinians started setting up checkpoints. They created a combined army called Jaysh Lebanon al-Arabi, which was the Arabic Lebanese army. And it was the combination of the Palestinians and the Lebanese Muslims. And they would set up checkpoints in the middle of the night, in the middle of the roads. And if they see a Christian, they would stop cars, and they would get people out of the car, and they would look at their ID. And if the ID said that this family is a Christian, because in Lebanon, we were identified on our IDs. Our religion was either Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. And we didn't have many Jews by that time. But when they would find out that this was a Christian family, they would get them out of the car and kill them, shoot the whole family. The word spread very fast, and Christians became prisoners to their own towns and their own communities. We were afraid to travel. But the major thing that changed my life was the bombing of my home. When the Lebanese Arabic army was trying to take over the military bases in Lebanon, they had taken over all the military bases with the exception of the military base above my home. They bombed that military base in an attempt to take it over. They missed the military base, and all their rockets exploded in my home, bringing it down and burying me under the rubble. I was wounded, and I ended up spending 2.5 months in the hospital. And I remember as a child asking my parents, why did they do this to us? And my father would always say, because we are Christians. They're trying to kill us. And I knew ever since I was a child that I am wanted dead simply because I was a Christian who happened to live in a Christian town.
What was life like after you came back from the hospital?
When I came back home, home was no longer the home that I left because my home was half destroyed. My new home became a bomb shelter underground with no electricity, no water, and very little food. My mother and I used to have to go out and hunt for grass and dig dandelions and any green vegetation that grew around our bomb shelter to eat. My mother would soak chickpeas overnight and rice and beans so we can eat that the next day. To get some water, we would crawl to a nearby spring to fetch some water, and we would crawl under snipers' bullets. And when we would get to the spring, we would be hiding behind the wall, and my mother would hold the gallon to fill it with water, and she would put a stocking on top of it to catch all the worms and all the maggots and all the rocks so we can drink the water. And then we would crawl back to the bomb shelter. Sometimes it would take us hours because of the sniper who was terrorizing us. And that went in and day out, year in and year out. Our life became unbearable. We had no electricity, so we had no heat. We were living underground in a cold, damp bomb shelter. During the day, we would let little rays of lights that we'd sneak in through the door and through the holes in the little window that we had. And at night, we would light kerosene candles, kerosene lamps, so we would have some light. And we would freeze. It was so cold. We would freeze. My father in the wintertime would break twigs, and we would make fire inside the shelter. And we would fall asleep. And most mornings, we would wake up with carbon monoxide poisoning. And whoever woke up first would drag the other two outside and slap them so we could wake up. And that's the type of life I lived. I lived in the bomb shelter from age 10 to age 17, robbed from my youth.
Well, what sort of tactics did the Palestinians use during the war?
When the Palestinians started fighting in Lebanon, the war took on such savagery that it was inconceivable for us to think of. they started massacring the Christian cities, city after city. One of the major massacres was the city of the Moor. They would walk into a bomb shelter and they would see a mother and a father hiding in the bomb shelter with a little baby. They would tie one leg of the baby to the mother and another leg to the father and pull the parents apart, splitting the child in half. They would walk into the churches and they would urinate and defecate on the altar using the Bible pages as toilet paper. The last friend that I had before I left Lebanon, who worked for me, she was mentally disturbed because they made her slaughter her own son on her lap. They tied her to a chair, tied a knife to her hand, held her hand, and made her cut her own son's throat. They would kill the Christian men, and one of the Palestinian signature killing way was to cut the genitals of the male and stick it in his mouth and cut a cross with a knife on his chest. That's how they used to kill the Christian men and leave them laying on the grounds in the moor. In my town, in the beginning of the war, when they were starting to take control a little bit, we would be hiding in the bomb shelter. And in the beginning of the war, the renters that rented from us, we all hid together in this small room, an 8 by 10 room. That's where 4 families lived. They had 9 children. We were 9 children in the bomb shelter. I was the oldest child. And the Palestinians would park their cannon in front of our bomb shelter and shoot at Israel, fully knowing that Israel is going to retaliate and we're going to die, because the way they would do it is they would shell Israel, then drive their tank away. So when Israel would shell back, we would, be dead, and we would make great evening news, great ratings. And that was a tactic that the Palestinians used over and over. They would hide between civilians. They would shoot their tanks and their cannons in between the civilians' home. And they always chose the Christians' homes only, not the Muslims' homes, because they wanted us to die, not the Muslims. And that's how the war continued. It was unbelievable for us as Christians to even fathom the barbarism and the monstrosities that they have committed, because we have no point of reference to such savagery.
Well, what was life like for you and your family in that bomb shelter?
Well, our back was to Israel, and the Palestinians were surrounding us to kill us. So we either were going to be killed and slaughtered by the Palestinians, or we go to Israel and beg for help. And we knew of the 2 evils, because remember, we were raised in Lebanon thinking that Israel is the devil, the Jews are evil. But we knew of the 2 evils. The Jews are not going to slaughter us, because after all, we had more shared values with them than we had with the Muslims and the Palestinians. So a few people from my town went to Israel and begged for help. And that's how we stayed alive. Israel would come in the middle of the night and would bring supplies to the Christians. They would bring food, milk for the children. They would bring ammunition to the military. They would take the Christian men and train them inside Israel, because the Christians were educated, but they didn't know how to street fight. We were not like the Palestinians. And you can have all the degrees on the wall, law degree, a doctorate. That does not defend your life from someone who is bent on killing you in the name of God. Israel was the only country that understood what the Christians were going through. And Israel stood by us and kept us alive. And that's how we stayed alive for 7 years. In 1982, Israel entered Lebanon. And notice how I say entered Lebanon, not invaded Lebanon. The Christians were praying for Israel to come into Lebanon and liberate them from the Palestinians. And the only reason Israel came into Lebanon was because Hezbollah was working with the Palestinians, also with the Syrians, and we had a lot of other Muslims from a lot of Arabic countries that came to Lebanon to fight Israel. And they started shelling Israel. And all the northern towns in Israel were being shelled to the point where their citizens were living in bomb shelters just like us. And this went on for months. It wasn't a matter of a month or 2. This went on for months. And Israel decided it's going to go into Lebanon and at least clear the Palestinians and push them far enough so that their artillery would not reach the northern towns of Israel. While Israel entered Lebanon, the Muslims and the Palestinians were shelling us frantically. One of their bombs exploded in front of my bomb shelter as my mother was running to the shelter, and she became wounded. When she became wounded, we had nowhere to take her in Lebanon. Our only lifeline was Israel. That's where all the sick went to get treated. That's where all the wounded went to get treated. Medical treatment free of charge to anyone that needed it for 7 years when Israel took care of us. We took my mother to get first aid at the Lebanese hospital in my town, which was a shell of a hospital. There was one Israeli doctor and two Israeli nurses on duty. They gave her first aid, and we put her in an Israeli-donated ambulance and drove her to the border. It was a 10-minute drive. The Lebanese driver, when we got to the border, walks over and asks me for money for the fee for the ambulance. And like an innocent teenager, I pull all the money that my daddy had given me out of my pocket, and I show it to him, and I say, "How much do I owe you?" And he looks at my money, and he says, "Give me 30, which was half the money I had. I gave it to him, and I thanked him from the bottom of my heart. He said that was the fee for the ambulance. They transferred my mother into another Israeli ambulance inside Israel, and that ambulance drove us to Sivat Hospital, which was an hour drive. The driver was an Israeli soldier. He was so nice to me. He treated me like his own daughter. He put me at such ease because I was afraid. I was afraid of the unknown. I was uncomfortable. I felt awkward. After all, I'm a Lebanese. I didn't have anyone in Israel. My mother was half unconscious in the back stretcher of the ambulance. And I was stunned at how nice that Israeli driver was. We got to the hospital. They took my mother out into the emergency room. I walked around to the Israeli driver to pay him my money, the fee for the ambulance. He looked at it and he said, "What is this?" And I said, "Don't you need the fee for the ambulance?" And he says, "No." He said, "This is a free service from us to you. Keep your money, and I wish you well. I hope your mothers recover." And I thought to myself, what an honest man. What an ethical man. This man could have taken my money and partied all night, and I would not have known the difference. Yet he didn't. And all of a sudden, I felt very angry because I realized that the Lebanese driver who drove me the 10-minute drive to the border basically robbed me. That was my first lesson in the character and values of the Arabic people and the Israeli people. We went into the emergency room, and there were hundreds of people wounded in the emergency room. There were Lebanese brought in from Lebanon. There were Christians brought in from Lebanon. Muslims brought in. Palestinians wounded brought in from Lebanon. And I could not believe my eyes. And I thought to myself, I can understand why they're treating me. After all, I am their friend. I'm a Christian. I am their ally. But why on earth are they treating the Palestinians and the Muslims? These are the enemy. These are the people who were bombing us. Little did I know about the values of the Israeli people. The doctors treated everyone according to their injury. They did not see religion. They did not see political affiliation. They did not see nationality. They treated people like human beings in need. The doctor treated my mother before he treated the Israeli soldier laying next to her because her injury was more severe. I thought to myself, this is unbelievable, but maybe that's the exception. They took my mother to the 4th floor of the hospital. And we were in the room maybe 5 minutes, and I heard all this commotion outside our window. And I went out to see what was happening. And 2 Israeli helicopters had just landed, bringing in Israeli soldiers wounded in Lebanon in the war. And I stood at that balcony, looking at that scene, looking down at the ground. I felt ashamed. I felt embarrassed. I felt out of place. After all, these people are wounded because of the war with my country. I didn't look at anyone around me. There were a lot of people. There were mothers of wounded soldiers, fathers who were in the hospital with their children, nurses. I didn't make any contact with anybody around me. And I kept looking at the floor. And then I felt this tapping on my shoulder. And I looked, and there was this Israeli nurse looking at me, and she said, "You are new here, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes. They just brought in my mother. She's in this room." And she could see the fear in my eye, and she just put her arm around me and said, "Don't worry, we'll take good care of her. Everything will be fine." And the first time in my life I experienced civilization. I broke out crying. I broke out sobbing because I experienced the compassion and love that I knew, and humanity that I knew that my society would not be able to show their enemy. I knew for a fact that if I was a Jew standing on the fourth floor of a Lebanese hospital, I will be lynched and thrown down to the ground as shouts of joy of Allahu Akbar will echo through the hallways of the hospital and down the surrounding streets. When the Israelis found out that there were Lebanese wounded in Israeli hospitals, they came in bringing presents. They came in extending a peaceful hand. They came in bringing chocolates. They would visit the wounded families and they would say, "What can we do for you? What can we bring you? Our homes are your home. If you need to stretch, if you need to sleep, if you missed bringing something from home, please let us bring it to you." It was unbelievable. I became friends with the families, with the mothers and the sisters of the wounded soldiers in the hospital. One in particular, Rina Potashnik, I'll never forget her name. Her only son, Amir, who was 19 years old, was wounded in the hospital in his eye, and he lost sight of that eye. And she became like my surrogate mother. I spent a lot of time with her because I was with my mom in the hospital for 22 days. And I would go visit Rina, and one day in particular, the Israeli army band came to play songs to lift the Israeli soldiers' souls. They came to play national songs, and I was visiting with her in her room, and they came to play the song, and they stood around Amir's bed. And I felt so out of place. I started walking out of the room, and she started crying, listening to the music. And when she sensed that I was walking backwards, so she wouldn't notice me even leaving the room, she pulls me by my hand, brings me back inside, and she hugs me, and she says, "It's not your fault." And we both stood there crying. And I thought to myself, what a contrast between her, a mother looking at her only child, only deformed child, and still able to love me, the Arab. What a contrast between her and a suicide bomber's mother who sends her only son and daughter to strap bombs around themselves and blow themselves up to smithereens just to kill a Jew or a few Jewish children. I